Hi, this is Dan from Binaural Recording Sights and Sound. And let you guys know that I did come back from the game on Expo and we did get some cool captures of the panels that were at the event. However, the binaural parts of it didn't actually turn out. So these recordings that you're going to see here are actually just going to be just the recordings, just with the production value and the things that I've added to it. Hopefully you guys enjoy it. Take a watch.
Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Just for my own information, by a show of hands, how many of you guys have 3D printers or have worked with 3D printers before? Okay, so a good chunk of you. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Jacob V. I go by Printbash Props on Instagram. I have 3D printed for about 7 years. I do my own 3D modeling and 3D printing. A lot of it is making board games. Is how I make my living. I make and sell board games, but when I have free time, I like to make ridiculous cosplay things. So today we're going to be talking about different kinds of 3D printers, different kinds of plastics and materials, and kind of how to choose what's best for each of you in your individual projects and your own maker teams. So the first step in choosing your 3D printer is identifying your printing needs. So if you are trying to manufacture something over and over again in like a business type setting, you're going to want something that's a little bit more compact, has more bells and whistles like automatic bed leveling or automatic filament sensor out. So it will detect when the filament in the printer runs out, things like that. But there are literally hundreds of different kinds of printers, and so you need to sit and figure out what is it that I want to make, and if it's cosplay oriented, if you're making large armor builds, you want a large format printer, something called a Core XY, which is like a big box, and the printer starts in the top and moves downward. If you were doing 3D printed tabletop miniatures like D&D or detailed cosplay props, you would want to get what's called a resin printer. It works on a completely different system. It's an SLA or a stereolithography printer, and it functions like an MRI in the way that you take a 3D model and it chops it into little pieces and layers, and then it starts in this vat of resin and slowly lifts upward using a photosensitive FET film that cures the UV sensitive resin on the bottom. And so it will tilt and lift up and then move and then print the next layer. FDM printing, which is fusion deposited material, is where you have a big roll of plastic and it will heat up that plastic and then put it through a nozzle of a particular diameter and then slowly build up layers that way. For pros and cons of each of them, FDM printing is a little bit slower than SLA, than the resin printers. The plastic, however, is much more easily accessible. It comes in a wider range of colors. Typically has less toxic options. Resin printing is very fast. However, resin prints can be brittle, and the resin is toxic until 100% cured. So this is an example of a beautiful SLA print. This is Bo-Katan from Star Wars, from an episode of Clone Wars. With an SLA print, because it only takes fractions of a second for a layer to cure, you can print even large things within hours that would take upwards of days on a resin or on an FDM printer. As you can see by this photo, it's almost a perfect item straight off the bat. And you have very minimal sanding you would have to do. You basically just need to clean the print, and then you can immediately go into primer before you start painting. Or if you have high quality artisan paints, you can go directly from resin to painting. Problem is that SLA printers are very prone to failure. And with, it's very frustrating.
It is.
And with resin prints, you cannot physically see that the print has failed until afterwards, because the failure is happening inside of the printer and it has to lift up high enough for you to see what's happened. So if you look here at the top of this photo, you can see that those pieces have totally removed from the build plate, and the printer is not able to continue printing there. As I previously stated, resin is fully toxic until you are curing it. It's toxic to touch, it's toxic to breathe, and it's a lot. In my workshop, I have this huge vinyl sheet that I have placed on my work surface, so that way it doesn't ruin the wood underneath it. And I have tools that are dedicated just for my resin printer, and I only handle them with nitrile gloves, with rubber gloves on, to protect my skin. Resin prints, with the exception of a few different kinds of resins, there's what's called ABS-like, which is much more robust, where there's flexible resin. If you drop a resin print, it is very likely to shatter. And I have friends that I have this one particular friend that went to Dragon Con about 4 or 5 years ago, and it was right during the Bowsette craze.
Oh.
And she had printed these really beautiful Bowsette horns, and she was trying to get them on, and she turned wrong, and her husband wasn't done pinning, and they fell and hit the ground, the tile ground in her hotel room, and it shattered everywhere, and she broke down crying and didn't go to the con that day. So it is beautiful, it has good uses, but it is dangerous sometimes. I do make a certain amount of resin props, but they're small, they're able to bounce a little bit. But if you choose resins that are specifically formulated for impact or high tensile strength, they are more costly, but they will save you the heartache of dropping a prop or a print and have it shatter. Additionally, resin is fairly expensive. They're sold in typically 200, 500, and 1,000 gram bottles. A 1,000 gram bottle of resin can run you upwards of $120. And that will only give you maybe like 10 or 15 prints depending on what you're doing. So you really have to research and decide what you're willing to sacrifice on. Amazon has a lot of different kind of resins that are significantly cheaper, but those are the lower grade ones that are more likely to fracture. This is several examples of resin prints that I have personally done and finished. On the left-hand side, if you guys are familiar with Star Wars, is Ahsoka Tano. I have a friend that worked at Disney as Ahsoka for special Star Wars parades, and she was married last year. And as a side hobby, I like to customize Monster High dolls. And so I used a doll base and customized her. But all of the armor pieces that you see on this doll that's roughly 12 inches are resin printed.
Nice.
Finished really nicely and then enameled, and that's silver leaf to get those colors. The lightsaber that you see that's directly next to it is a all resin print. I took screenshots from the Phantom Menace. It's Obi-Wan's Episode 1 Star lightsaber. And that was all resin printed, enameled, and chromed. And if you look close, there's a couple of different like lighter red pieces that were translucent resin. And then these other three examples, one is a Dungeons & Dragons miniature from Season 0 of Yu-Gi-Oh!, which is a little bit of a deep cut from the, what do they call it, the Kakumon? Quinn, do you remember what that series is called? Monster World.
That would be, it's the Monster World.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's a Monster World mini. This thing is made out of Prusament resin anthracite tuff. And this I have personally thrown on the tile ground by accident, and it's totally good. That resin is very expensive, but I love it. To the left of that is a Beskar ingot, also from Star Wars, and that shows a little bit of my finishing process. Again, made from that anthracite resin, but this thing is hollow and then was filled with pouring resin, so I would save time, and that resin poured inside reinforces the outside, so it feels heavy like a piece of metal, but it's not as expensive. And this last example is a Sailor Moon Henshin wand, which is all resin printed in a couple of different colors there because they have different properties. The same anthracite gray for high impact resistance. The star and the handle are made from a more flexible resin, so that way if a cosplayer were to drop it, it would not shatter. Before we move on to FDM printing, are there any questions about SLAs? Yes, sir.
I was wondering about the lightsaber. How long did that take with everything?
Okay, so this lightsaber was part of a competitive costume that I made of Obi-Wan for Phantom Menace. I went for screen accuracy. So this alone took roughly 27 hours to 3D model. And then printing was, I think like 40, somewhere around there. It's made in, it looks like a singular piece. It's actually made in about 15 parts. And it slots together. And then sanding was a breeze. I think I spent maybe an hour sanding it at most. I had some occlusions in the print that I had to sand away and then fill in with body filler. And then enamel and chrome. So altogether, probably about 70, a little under 70 hours to make that lightsaber. Thank you. I have problems. So fusion deposited material printing, or FDM printing, is the more common kind that people use. It's more accessible, the printers are cheaper, you can customize or make your printer from scratch, and there's people that have huge printers that are like 8 feet by 8 feet by 10 feet tall, and they can make these really elaborate sculptures with them. PLA plastic is easily accessible, pretty cheap, and it comes in pretty much any color you could ever possibly want. Depending on the kind of filament that you get, it can run you anywhere from like $17 a roll upwards of $50 a roll, and those come in 2 kilogram rolls typically. They're also, the majority of FDM prints are made from non-toxic materials. We'll get into those a little bit later. But again, these are a few examples of what FDM prints look like. So as compared to the resin or the SLA print, those come out totally perfect almost. As opposed to this, you can see very clear delineation of layer lines. This is what a resin failure or an FDM failure looks like. It's spaghetti. We call it spaghetti. It is a pain in the butt when that happens because the bed of the printer has to stay hot in order for a print to stay attached. And there's multiple reasons for why that would for why a print would lift up. But that's typically what you get is either layer shifting, where it's like the model has just been chopped and then moved over, or you get just a big old mess, and it's a pain in the butt to clean off of your hot end of your extruder, the actual part that heats up to around 400 degrees and melts the plastic. Physical FDM printing takes a significantly longer amount of time to finish to be smooth and nice, as compared to resin, where like I just talked about my lightsaber, that took me very little time. Most of my FDM prints take upwards of 10 to 15 hours of sanding in order to get them to look the way that I personally like them to look. Additionally, they can take heat damage very, very easily. We live in Arizona, it's hot here. If you leave a 3D print in your car, it's dead. It will warp and it will break, and there's basically nothing you can do to fix it. And it is really heartbreaking when there's a piece of armor that you left in a car and forgot about it and come back to it and it's imploded on itself. Ask me how I know. It's not what you want. This is some examples of FDM prints that I've made. In this upper left-hand corner, are any of you guys familiar with Animal Crossing? Yeah, a couple of you. So there's a character in Animal Crossing named Brewster. He runs a cafe. And when you do enough interactions with him, he gives you this little cookie jar. And so this is a cookie jar that I had printed for my sister-in-law for Christmas one year with a matching little cookie cutter. This Boba Fett throne is also an FDM print. And I used a textured finishing technique to hide my layer lines because there's so many small little areas on it that it's hard to get in and sand. To the right of that is a communicator that I also made for my Obi-Wan costume. This is made from something called PETG, which is what soda bottles are made out of, and so it is a little bit more heat resistant and easier to sand, but we'll get deeper into that later. Bottom left is another lightsaber. This is Luke's lightsaber from episode 6, I think. Yeah. And that thing took me, I think I spent 3 weeks making that lightsaber. And it was a pain in the butt because FDM prints don't like to be sanded very well. But there are situations where you don't need to sand it. Like for example, this statue of Rivali from Breath of the Wild. That's a 3D scan of his amiibo that was put up online, and so I printed it at like 400% size, and it's about 9.5 inches tall. And other than the support material residue that's on the base of it, that thing is basically ready to go. It can take a layer of primer and you would be good. These Pokeballs next to it are some of the product that or my bread and butter. I make and sell a ton of these, and I've got a variety of them available at my table. But when you have your settings dialed in well enough and you have a well-built printer, you can have very, very nice prints come directly off of the printer and just push repeat over and over and over again. And then this bottom right thing here is the Millennium Ring from Yu-Gi-Oh!, which actually is Noon's. That was a commission that I made for Noon a few years ago. And that is real gold leaf. So it was an FDM print made out of PLA that was sanded to heck and back, and if you look close, there's no seams. All of those pieces were printed interlocked with each other. So they're not coming apart.
So it was a puzzle, you would say.
A Millennium puzzle, even. But we'll get into body shopping a little bit later. But that whole thing was printed in one piece, body filled, sanded, and then I use an enamel layer, which gives me almost a perfectly smooth surface, and then I use a liquid gold leaf to cover those pieces, and it turns out like it's made out of cast gold. It's one of my favorite techniques to use.
It looks great in person.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
Process.
So before we move on, are there any questions about FDM printing?
So does it make it easier? You were talking about the way that it does print. So if you're doing like the dice towers or you're doing something a little bit bigger, it's easier to do it that way than it is with resin because of the way that the machine actually layers the material?
More or less. With the dice tower in particular, that's a ton of resin. And unless you printed it hollow, the plastic print would be a little bit better for that type of thing. If only because it's going to be easier to like get in there and deal with it and transport it from place to place.
Yeah, because I could not get the print to break down small enough to print out of the resin one, and I'm just like, I had a print to do Castle Grayskull, and the dice tower was the mouth where it came out, but the Castle came out and was done the master screen as well, and I'm just like, that's a worker resin.
No, it's
Yeah.
it just says FLA on it, and our friend is like, yeah, we can't print that for you. It's too big.
Yeah. There's a few, I believe Frozen, PHROZEN, makes a printer called the Phoenix that is a large format resin printer that has a built volume of like 14 inches by 14 inches by 16 inches, but those machines are wildly expensive.
Yeah.
They're pretty to look at though. Yes, sir.
So you mentioned that this process is harder for heat. What's a good way to keep it from melting or exploding?
So we'll get to that in a minute.
Okay.
I do have a whole thing about finishing your prints to make them heat resistant.
Okay.
But the short answer is to use a plastic that has a higher glass point. A glass point is the temperature at which a plastic item will start to bend. Certain plastics, all plastics are not made equal. So PLA has a very low glass point, and if you keep something that's made out of PLA in a hot car for a couple hours, it's like 120 degrees inside, your print is done for. Whereas PETG, like soda bottle plastic, that is not as bad. You need like maybe another 20 or 30 degrees Fahrenheit for that to start being flexible. And then there's other plastics that are toxic, so you have more precautions you have to deal with. Like ABS, what Legos are made out of, those things do not budge. But also they are a pain in the butt too. Okay, anything else before we move on? Cool. How are we doing on time? Oh, we're good. We're barely 20 minutes in. So, filament is what you call the plastic. It's a very long, thin piece of plastic that gets spooled up. They typically come in 2 diameters, and so if you are brand new to 3D printing, the hot end, which is like a chunk of aluminum or lead that physically heats up with electricity, and it melts this item. And there's some that are built for industrial work that take 3 millimeter filament, 3 millimeter diameter filament, as opposed to some of the more hobby-oriented printers are 1.75 millimeters. And you need to, when you are looking for filament, you need to make sure that you specify your diameter Otherwise, you can mix and match and you'll end up with a filament that won't go into your printer. Spools can come in a variety of different weights, depending on what the material is and how costly it is. The more expensive the material, the smaller the reel tends to be. And so there's like certain flexibles that will come on rolls that are only 125 grams, as opposed to PLA is typically a full kilo. And there's even like 5, 8, and 10 kilogram reels that you can get that will make it so you don't have to monitor the printer quite as much. But I think I ran out of time for ASA, but we have PLA, which is what I've talked about multiple times, PETG, which is the soda bottle plastic, ABS, which is toxic, but is what Legos are made out of. ASA is also a toxic filament, but it is very heat resistant, and is what some people will print 3D printer parts out of that are around that hot end, because they can deal with temperatures of up to 200 degrees Fahrenheit without being a problem. PLA Pro, or PLA Plus, or PLA Ultra, all the same name for the same kind of thing, is like PLA, but it has certain amount of additives put into them, don't know what, that make them more heat resistant, easier to print, and a little bit more flexible, so they're not quite as brittle. And then TPU, which is a subclass of filament that's flexible. And TPU is based on a shore hardness scale, which we'll get into that a little bit, but you can have TPU that's firm, like hard car tire rubber, and is soft as silicone. Yes, sir.
Anything else besides the ABS and the ASA that's toxic, or?
Sorry?
You said ABS and the ASA were toxic?
Yes.
Were any of the others, or are those the only two?
On this particular list, those are the only two that are toxic that I'm talking about.
Okay.
I want to say that it's, I forget exactly what it is. A lot of filaments are made in China, and they have less strict regulations about what they're allowed to put in it. So you would need to specifically research what kind of filament you intend to use for a project to check whether it's toxic or not. Those particular toxic filaments need ventilation. So if you have a large workshop and you have an open window with a fan going, you would be fine. Or there's some printers that are in an enclosure that have like a duct system that will pull those fumes out. I have only printed with ABS once, and it almost instantly gave me a migraine within a few hours. And even with having the window open, I wasn't able to, one, print with it because I didn't have a proper enclosure, but two, the fumes were so overwhelming. I think I got sidetracked there, but there are more kinds of filament than what I'm talking about here. I just don't know all of them.
I'm just trying to stay away from the toxic stuff.
That's understandable. For the most part, if you print with PLA or PETG, you'll be okay. They do come with a certain smell, like you're melting plastic. It smells like burnt plastic. Some filaments, like there's a wood filament that I like to work with sometimes. It's kind of expensive, so it's not often. But it's made with wood additive inside it, so you can paint it and stain it like real wood. And this particular company that I bought from, I think it's Eryoin, E-R-Y-I-N-E, however you say that. They make it from maple trees, and so it smells kind of like the sweet syrup as it prints. So PLA, which is polylactic acid, is a bioplastic made from either corn or potato starch, and it's processed with pellets that give it the color. This Mandalorian helmet in Pauldron is an example of one of my PLA prints. That thing was a little bit of a beast, and I think it spent about 60 or 70 hours sanding on it in order to get it looking that way. It is the most common kind of filament that you can buy, so it's very cost effective, typically like $17 to $25 per kilogram. And it will come in any color that you could ever possibly want. And there are certain companies, there's boutique filament companies that you can contact and have custom colors made by using Pantones. So if you are making or producing at a larger scale and there's something really specific that you want for a raw print, you can have custom filament made. It's, as previously stated, it's non-toxic because it's basically made out of sugar. You get kind of a burnt sugar smell sometimes, but for the most part, it's a a really easy filament to work with. Any questions? Okay. This is a further example of PLA. This is the golden sarcophagus from Yu-Gi-Oh! Similar situation. This was printed in PLA, sanded, enameled, and then gold leafed. PLA has a low blast point and so will damage easily in the heat. It will either flex or the heat inside of the print will expand and it will cause the infill, and we'll talk about that in a minute. 3D prints are not solid. They are a hollow shell with a kind of honeycomb work inside of them. So there's a lot of air, and that air will heat up and expand, and that will destroy your print from the inside. PLA can also be kind of brittle. It's fine if you drop it for the most part, but if you try to bend it or reshape it without using heat, they will snap on you. And when they snap, they get sharp, and I've cut myself many times on broken PLA prints. PLA is also one of the more difficult to sand kinds of plastic. Depending on how you choose to body shop your prints. Some people, like I prefer to sand my print first before I get into the body shopping. But other people will go directly into Bondo and filler or resin or however they want to fill their layer lines. And if you're doing that, then great, but in my situation, oh, I'm so sorry, let me put my phone on second. There we go. But PLA, of the kinds of filaments that we'll be talking about, is physically harder to sand, like it has a harder density to it. So any questions about PLA? Okay. Yes?
So what grit would you recommend if you're trying to sand?
So what?
What grit would you recommend if you are trying to sand it?
So, you want to go pretty low, like in the 50 to 100 range for your first round, and then you work your way up through the different grits. I think I talked about in this one. I think I talked about that in this one. I have two panels back to back here, and I made them at the same time, so the things are a little fuzzy, but like Noon was talking about, when you sand something, you want to start with a low grit, which means the pieces on the sandpaper are chunkier and they will pull off more with each swipe. And you want to slowly build your way up to higher grit filaments. Now, PETG, I'm not going to say those words, I don't know how to say them. Glycol, I know glycol. PETG is soda bottle plastic. It's recyclable. So if you want to drop it off at a recycling plant, you can, or you are physically capable of like crushing this filament down into pellets, and if you have the machine for it, you can make your own filament out of PETG. And there's a whole community of people that have these little, I don't remember what they're called, but they're these little stations where you can take soda bottles, cut them into strips, and then feed them and make your own PETG plastic. It's really interesting. PETG is also on the more affordable scale. It's more expensive than PLA. It comes in typically about $20 to $30 per kilogram roll. It is more heat resistant than PLA, but if you are dealing with like a high heat gun, you can ruin it that way. I've done that more than a couple of times. But I have had PETG prints of, like finished props. I have on Sunday I have a Kingdom Hearts cosplay that has a very large, like 42-inch keyblade weapon. That was left in the car on the way down. I live up in Prescott, and we drove down here, and it took 0 damage on the way from there to Phoenix, and then we got stuck in line waiting to get in here. So probably not good to leave unattended in a hot vehicle, but I don't have to worry about a PETG print melting in the car on the way to something. PETG is also very soft. It's easy to sand. Certain kinds of companies have less additives in it, and you can like scratch it with your thumbnail almost. But for the most part, because PETG is a soft filament, some people add a kind of hardener into the mix when they're manufacturing the filament. But because of that natural softness that PETG has, it means it's really easy to sand. It's like butter. But as it says at the bottom, it's ideal for making your 3D printed cosplay props, or if you are an animatronic maker or a robotic builder, the internal heat of your electronics will not damage the outside finish of your pieces. Here's said key blade. It is, as previously stated, it is more expensive than PLA. It comes in less colors because of that, because less manufacturers make it. But you can typically get like your RGBW and a few other colors in between. The fumes can be irritating. I personally do not have a problem with PETG, but it smells a little worse than PLA plastic does. However, these are non-toxic fumes. So it's more of if you have respiratory issues, it will give you trouble. PETG is also more difficult to print with because it has a higher glass point. You have to work at higher temperatures, and unless your printer is in an enclosure, the ambient temperature of the room that you're printing in can cause the print on the edges to cool and to lift, and that will instantly kill your print. It's a sad time. Any questions about PETG? Yes.
For this and some of the other filaments, are they waterproof when they're finished?
Yes. So it's just like any other plastic. The only filament that is not water safe, or I guess define waterproof, what do you mean by that?
Like, if you put it in water, I guess, like, not for like swimming or anything, but like,
Yeah.
just, yeah, if you dropped it in like water.
Yeah, they would be fine.
Okay.
The only filament that you couldn't do that with is called PVOH or PVA, and that's typically used for support material, which we'll get into in a minute. But those are meant to dissolve in either alcohol or water. Getting a print to physically contain water is an entirely different subject and probably a panel into itself. To put in water, and in fact, I put them almost every single print in water when I wet sand. Okay, ABS is a derivative of polystyrene. It's made from petrol, and so it is an incredibly strong plastic. It's also very, very, very easy to sand. And so you can typically start with much higher grits, like upwards of 100, 200, 300, as you're sanding your ABS prints. One really neat thing is because ABS is acetone reactive, some people will take their ABS print and they'll soak paper towels in acetone and put it inside a container. And they let that acetone vaporize, and it will attach to the outside layer of the print, and it will melt that plastic, and it will cause those layer lines to almost totally disappear because it's filling in with itself. It has a high glass point, so you can throw that thing basically anywhere, and it's not doing anything. They are really solid. Another point that I don't have here is that you don't actually need glue to attach ABS pieces to each other. You can take acetone and melt down pieces of your filament and turn it into what's called a slurry, an ABS slurry. And you can put just a little bit of slurry on your pieces that you intend to attach, and it's like they were printed inherently together. It's stronger than any other kind of glue, and it gives you perfect adhesion every time. It's fun. I've never had a chance to try it because I have such a reaction to ABS, but maybe one day. ABS fumes are highly toxic. You can have respiratory failure if you are around it for too long, and they must be ventilated. It is very hard to print with. It's harder to print with than even PETG, and is very prone to lifting. However, if you are able to get your print to stick to your printer well, then you don't have to worry about other kinds of failures that you can have with your 3D printing. To help mitigate that, if you have an enclosure, it makes printing ABS much, much easier. Some people will take like the Pink Panther insulation foam, and they'll just make a box with insulation foam and I forget exactly what it's called, but it's like that tinfoil duct tape. It's not duct tape brand.
Plumber's
It's like,
tape.
yes, plumber's tape. Thank you. So you can use plumber's tape and pink insulation foam to make an enclosure that you can start your print and then just pop over your printer, and that will insulate your printer well enough that it keeps the temperature inside of that area well enough to keep the ABS from cooling too much and lifting prematurely. ABS is a non-recyclable plastic, so if it messes up, you cannot make new ones, and you need to dispose of it responsibly, which is another reason why I don't like to use ABS. It is also more expensive. It's roughly in the same range as PETG, but not by much. So any questions about ABS?
You said though, what's the best way to dispose of it?
So it's difficult because each region has different rules about throwing away ABS plastic.
Yeah.
But if you take it to like your petrol plant, like where you dispose of used car oil, they would typically be able to take care of it.
Okay.
Anyone else? 25 minutes. So TPU is one of my favorite filaments to work with. It's thermoplastic polyurethane. It is flexible, it is shatterproof, and it comes in a variety of shore hardnesses. Shore, I don't know who that man is, but shore hardness is a scale that determines the amount of squishability. The lower the number, the firmer it is. So 0 would be, I believe, is diamond, and it moves upward from there. I think like 200 or 300 is the maximum number on this scale. I'm not intimately familiar with it. But when you are looking for TPU plastics, they will have a number next to them typically. Most of the time, like the stuff that's readily available on Amazon is about a 40 to 70 shore hardness. So it will give you something soft and flexible, but will still retain its shape. I have TPU prints that I've taken and thrown on the ground, chucked across rooms, left in a hot car. This stuff is phenomenal. However, it's flexible, so if that's not something that you want for your finished piece, then those points aren't important. It also has a very, very high glass point. When you print with flexibles, it's typically the absolute hottest your printer is capable of printing. Printers work almost exclusively in Celsius, but when I print with TPU, I have to put my printer almost to 300 degrees. It is wild. But they make for some really cool things. Like in this upper right-hand corner here, these are little details that I printed for a friend's cosplay on Sunday that are like star details that will be glued to shoes. And then these rings and wristband are also made from that same material, so I'm able to put them on and squish them, and I don't get that like tactile hardness from a 3D print. And then the wristband there, I'll talk about that in my next panel. You can print TPU in very, very fine layers, almost like a sheet, and you can make heat transfer like vinyl pieces out of TPU in custom shapes. And you can like iron them into fabric or other things or other 3D prints. And it's a difficult thing to do and it takes practice, but it's a very cool technique. So any questions about TPU?
Where can you get the harder TPU? You said Amazon's about a 40. Where would you get like a 0?
Well, zero, I don't know that you can find a true 0 filament because short hardness is also used for like silicone hardnesses. There's a brand called Ninja Flex, and they, I believe that they have a retail outlet on Amazon, but they mostly sell from their website. They have, I believe, about 5 or 6 different shore harnesses in their TPU. Their thing is that whatever additive they put in it makes it very stretchy. So it's firm, but it's plastic, if that makes sense. Yeah. Yes, sir.
And then the short hardness, if it's like harder, would it be more expensive versus something like 40 or something higher?
It depends on the brand, to be honest. Some brands, the formula isn't consistent from company to company. And so whatever additive they use to make something more flexible, depending on where it's made, may be cheaper to you. All right, we good? We good? All right. Am I boring you guys? I feel like I have a very monotone voice. Cool.
You're good.
Okay. So these are the aforementioned demon shoes. My size 18 box of shoes from Kingdom Hearts 2. TPU is a beast to print. So the majority of your printing surfaces are going to be made out of what's called PEI. PEI is a copolyester plastic. and it's able to withstand 400 or 500 degrees before it starts to melt. So it's ideal for your heated printer beds. Because of that, other filaments that also contain polyester, like TPU, will try to form what's called covalent bonds. A covalent bond is where the atoms try to physically join together, and that happens on a microscopic layer. So oftentimes, if you do not print with the correct settings or the correct print surface, with a TPU print, you go to pull it off, it won't come off, and when it does, it ruins your print surface. And it's not a good day. TPU is also phenomenally difficult to sand and make look smooth. The only thing that I have personally had success with smoothing TPU prints with are diamond head Dremel files. So they're like Dremel drums that you can just buy them off of Amazon. They're not that hard to come by. But they're literally like a diamond file that you use to sand them down. And the techniques that you use to finish with TPU prints are wildly different than what you use for normal, like even PLA or PETG. But at the end, you end up with something that's flexible, safe, and really, really robust. TPU by nature, because it's flexible, is not compatible with the majority of superglues or other adhesives. These particular shoes, I used Gorilla Glue Fast Hold, which is a more silicone-based glue. And so the seam remains flexible because if the glue is hard and not able to flex with the print, it will immediately shatter your piece will fall apart. TPU also, because of how difficult it is to manufacture, is only available in maybe like 10 colors at most. So you have to kind of settle for what you want. Yes?
Does TPU take paint as well?
It does, actually, because it's a polyurethane, or it's a polyurethane. You can use basically just like acrylic graphic paint, and you can paint directly on it. Cloud Effects works really, really well with TPU prints. Or if you don't have something flexible, you can put a layer of plastic down on that print first, and then you can paint it with whatever you want. Do you have a question, or? Yeah, okay, cool. So, this is a little bit more for the people that have not printed before. People who have printed know heartbreak of managing around your support material. So, this is the Rivali statue from a little bit earlier. There are what's called overhangs. An overhang is anything that's not 90 degrees. Once you start going over 90 degrees, your print can only go to 45 before gravity is greater than the hold of the plastic. And so it will turn into spaghetti. So to combat that, the printer will use a sacrificial amount of plastic, putting down, we call it support material, that will allow the plastic to not droop so much and have a firm surface to sit on so it can build up. So if you look close, like the beak and the end of the scarf, and then on the far left side there's the end of that bow. Those pieces interface with just the areas that need that additional support, so it will print smoother. You can totally get away with not using support material if you know what you're doing. It takes a little bit of time to figure out, but there are certain methods for 3D modeling where you never exceed a 45-degree chamfer, and you don't have to do any kind of support material for those pieces. Additionally, you can print multiple pieces and then assemble to prevent needing support material. Any questions there? Yes, sir.
I printed a 11-inch Hulk, and it's got that, but I tried sanding it and it melted.
What are you sanding with?
Just some sort of drill we got, Walmart drill. I don't know what the bits are though.
Oh, so you're using like a rotary tool for that?
Yeah.
So, are you printing with PLA?
Yeah.
So PLA is very, very easy to overheat with a Dremel tool. I use a hat sander, I use a mouse sander actually, it's like a handheld sander. I would recommend turning down the RPMs of your rotary tool, otherwise you're going to melt all the way through your print every single time. But that's kind of inherent with PLA. PLA will heat up very quickly, and is very good at dispersing that heat, and so your PLA print can overheat quickly. Does that make sense? Okay. I would try, again, turning down your RPMs on your rotary tool, and then maybe try doing some hand sanding or using a different type of tool that doesn't move so quickly, and it'll prevent the overheating problem. Yes?
It's kind of for sports, but it's more like how you print separate pieces and then put them together. Well, for PLA, what would be the most recommended adhesive?
So PLA, because it's sugar-based, you can essentially use whatever works for you. My preferred glue of choice is Bob Smith, which is available on Amazon. You can get it in most hobby stores. People use it to assemble like gun plug kits and model kits and airplanes and things like that, like model airplanes. It comes in multiple thicknesses, and I prefer to use the medium gap filling. And I don't think I've ever had a problem with Bob Smith coming apart once it's glued. For the most part, Bob Smith is so strong that you will have a failure on the layer line before you have a failure on your glue seam.
Oh, wow. Nice.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else? How are we doing on time? We got 15 minutes. Okay. I'm on slide 18, I think. Okay. Thank you. So this is an example of two different common types of support material. These are Pokeball halves. This left one, this white piece, you can see how it kind of follows the contours of that inside shape. That dome, because it exceeds 45 degrees, needs additional support. And in your slicer, it will automatically calculate what areas need more support or less depending on the angle of that particular layer. So if you look closely, you can see that on the sides where it's not as steep, the support material is not as intense, and then there at the very center, it's very dense. The white is called, I think they just call it grid or close, if I remember correctly, but the printer literally just makes a giant zigzag back and forth until it builds up that ultimate shape to where it needs. The red stuff on the right is what's called organic or tree supports, and if you look close, it looks like it's a bunch of trees. It starts with these large nodes, and then it casually brings it in closer and then branches off. It's becoming more and more common to use organic or tree supports in 3D printing as it's quicker, it uses less plastic, and you're able to be much more precise. It also will just like very easily pop off in your finished print. So I am a big proponent of tree supports, but there are certain situations in which you need the additional structure for long prints, for example, that you would need that tight zigzag type support material. Any questions there? Okay. As I previously mentioned, there is a kind of filament called PVA or PVOH. PVA is literally like spool glue. It's like long strands of hard spool glue, and when it heats up, it will stick to the print bed and it will stick to the plastic, but you can take a really complicated piece, and if you have a printer that's able to swap filaments or a dual head printer, you can print your support material in just your PVA or PVOH, and then your model in your desired plastic. And when that piece is finished, you chuck it in a water bath or an alcohol bath for a couple of hours, and you come back and it's fully clean. And that makes your cleanup much easier, but also it's a pain in the butt to do, but then you have nothing to deal with at the end. You don't have much waste. Any questions? So body shopping is the process of taking a raw 3D print and turning it into a finished object. This is a Bo-Katan helmet from Star Wars that I recently made for FanFusion. This shows you a couple of the different layers of body shopping. You don't have to body shop your prints if you don't want to. I use both raw prints and body shopped prints in different ways, and sometimes I'll mix the two on a singular piece, or prop, what have you. But for the most part, if you are interested in 3D printing for like competitive type situations, you need to body shop your parts. Body shopping, even just a single layer of primer, will make your paint go on smoother. It will create a better bond because the acetone vehicle that's in most Bondo or most spray primers will break down a little bit that first layer of plastic, and and that Bondo binds to it very, very easily, or the primer bonds to it very easily. And then you can put basically any kind of paint you want on it. So even if you don't want to spend hours like a crazy person like me sanding on your prints for days or weeks on end, put a layer of spray primer down on your piece and it'll make your life easier just in the long run. I guess, let me go back here. So if you look close, there's some red areas and some gray areas and then some white and blue. This helmet was printed in a couple of different colors because I ran out of the blue. So that's the raw print that you're seeing there. Underneath that is a layer of Bondo Spot Putty, which is a car body shopping product that you can get from like Walmart, Amazon. You can get it from AutoZone. It's like 3 or 4 times as expensive as a Applied AutoZone.
Really?
Yes. So I forget how many ounces are in it, but I think it's like 10 or 15. Those single tubes will be like $10 at AutoZone, and you can get them at Walmart for like 3 or 4. So every couple of months I've got 3 Walmarts in my area, I'll go and I'll clean them out of Bondo and I'll be good for a year. Because that stuff does not go bad. It will separate with time, but it's body filler with an acetone vehicle. So you can add acetone to it to thin it down and put on thinner layers and make it smoother. But for the most part, it's great stuff. It does almost all of the heavy lifting when it comes to body shopping. And then on top of that, you use automotive body spray filler, which comes in a much, much thinner coat, and you're able to get and localize areas that need additional work. I do cover body shopping much more in depth in the panel that's directly after this, if you're interested in coming to that. But are there any quick questions about body shopping right now? Okay, cool. There's multiple methods for body shopping, and it really depends on what you're trying to finish with. There's the finished Bo-Katan helmet and a Obi-Wan Kenobi pauldron from Clone Wars. Those were bondoed, primed, sand, enameled, etc. Whereas that horn piece, I don't know if any of you are familiar with my body of work, but this last year I competed in Sabo 10 in a Helios from Sailor Moon cosplay, and
Best in show.
I wasn't going to say that. I won Best in Show in this costume. Thank you, I appreciate that. But one of the techniques that I used to net me points in that competition was sanding down a translucent print and getting a smooth finish without using Bondo or body filler, and it allowed me to insert 42 LEDs in this horn. This horn is roughly maybe 6 inches tall. And I used fairy light LEDs in order to light it up. But you either sand down your piece forever using progressively higher grits of sandpaper until it's totally smooth, or you add to it. You've really got to figure out what you want out of the project and what works best for you, what's your time constraints, your budgeting. And as I've talked about a little bit, the most common materials for body shopping besides sandpaper are automotive body putty, like the red Bondo, automotive spray primer, typically Rust-Oleum spray primer, or Duplicolor are the 2 most common used among cosplayers. Some people don't like the toxicity of those products. I typically wear a mask when I work with those because the acetone can be so overwhelming. But you can use just like wood filler like you would for carpentry, and that doesn't have those additives or what's called VOCs, volatile organic components. Compounds, not components. And so you can use wood filler on 3D prints like you would a woodworking project, and it will do almost as good of a job as Bondo. And then some people are preferential to resin. You can take like your 3D printer resin and you can just pour it over your print and brush it into your areas and then cure that. There are products made specifically for 3D print body filling, something called XTC 3D, Epsilon Pro. These are made by Reynolds Advanced Materials, which we're super lucky to have one here, and you can go there, and those people have much more advice than I do about body filling with resin. But are there any questions about that? Okay, perfect. here are those examples. Elmer's makes wood filler, Rust-Oleum, Duplicolor, Bondo. XTC 3D is something that I've worked with many, many times. It is a highly reactive polyester-based resin, so it smells awful, but you also only have about 5 minutes to work with it, so you have to do it in very small batches if you're working on a large piece. It also requires a lot of sacrificial pieces, so you need extra chip brushes, foam brushes, safe space to do it in high ventilation. And then, again, one of the easier way out is using UV reactive resin. It's most common for people to use the 3D print resin, because there's some resins that you can get on Amazon that are like $17 for a full 1,000 milliliter tube. I believe it's called Sophie and Toffee, which is a crafting resin, and you can buy that on Amazon, and it's a little bit more expensive, but it's a heavier body, and so you can brush it and control exactly where you're putting it, and then you can either put it outside or use a UV flashlight and cure those, or one of those, I think they're like manicure stations or something, like what people use to cure gel nail polish. All of those can be used to cure resin for body filling. The complication with using resin is that even though it's not toxic by the time you've cured that resin, you have to wet sand it, because the resin particles are so small they can go into your lungs when you breathe, and that can cause cancer. So not a fun time. But wet sanding is not that big of a deal for the most part. So again, talking about sanding, it's a multi-stage process. You begin with low grits, typically 50, 60, 80, and you move your way up. So you would take your piece and you would sand the whole thing with a low grit, and then you would move to another higher grit, sand the whole thing, move to a higher grit, sand the whole thing, over and over and over again until it reaches your desired smoothness. I personally use a mouse sander by Ryobi. It's a sander that's maybe about like this big, and it's battery operated, so I can take it anywhere, do anything I want with it, and I just keep batteries on charge. They have their own battery and charging system. And you typically want to finish your prints with as high a grit as possible. They go upwards of, I think it's about 1,000 or 2,000, and then you get into what's called micro mesh. And micro mesh is like extra fine sandpaper, to the point where you can't physically tell the difference between those pieces. And they use their own grit system, and they tell you like use pink first, then blue first, then yellow first, and that corresponds to the smoothness of that sandpaper. Do we have any questions? No? Okay. So, in conclusion, you're gonna mess up a lot, you're gonna fail a lot. Ask me how I know. I fail so often in 3D printing, and that's kind of the dirty secret of 3D printing, is that people don't talk about how often they mess up, they fail, they ruin a print, they use the wrong setting, they don't clean their build plate right. You will fail oftentimes more than you are successful, and that is okay. Don't let the fear of failure prevent you from improving your craft at 3D printing. There are multiple communities that have very experienced people better than me, that know exactly what your printer is doing wrong, know exactly what product you've used wrong, know exactly what to tell you to fix your print or to make you more successful in your 3D printing. There's YouTube channels such as Maker's Muse, Make Anything, the 3D Printing Nerd, Thomas Sandlatter, also known as the 3D Printing Senpai. But if you just look up like 3D printer review on YouTube, you'll find all of these people that do 3D printing or 3D printing influencing as their jobs. And they have tens of printers from different companies and have a lot of experience and knowledge. I get a lot of my information through Reddit. I personally use Prusa printers. I used to use Onnit. I've worked with Creality a little bit. I don't care for either of those anymore. Prusa is kind of like the Cadillac of 3D printers. Way more expensive, but they do basically everything for you. I do my model, I set my filament type, I put my file into the printer, and it goes. And with my situation, that's what I need. Some people feel 3D printing is a hobby, and that's valid. There's people that want a 3D printer that they can tinker with and change and augment and do all these different things to, and there's a whole community dedicated to that. I'm a person that wants stuff. I like stuff, and so I like to use a Prusa. But additionally, this hobby is always changing. So every few months there's a new printer, every few months there's a new technique, every few months there's something wild that you can never have imagined that's there. So have fun, I guess. I don't know, are there any questions in general? You certainly like.
So if you're gonna make a stunt prop or a stunt weapon that may have to take impact, what material would you use to choose that impact?
So, is it for cosplay or is it like filming?
It'd probably be for cosplay, but I wouldn't be able to like bump it into something, or if it does, like I have to make contact, it's not gonna just break or fall apart.
So if it's something like let's say a sword, there's certain things like adding armatures inside of your print that will allow your print to be stronger. Like those keyblades that I showed you earlier, those have 3/4 inch wooden dowels at the center of them. Not because I intend to fight with them, but because I need them to be strong.
For rigidity to make sure.
Exactly. If they are going to be hitting people, you would want to use something like TPU, or there is a particular kind of PLA that my dad also 3D prints with me, and he does model airplanes. And I can't think of exactly what it's called, but it's a PLA that's heat reactive with bicarbonate. So the PLA will foam up as it's printing, and that makes for very light and then impact resistant prints. I do talk a little bit about, I think we talk about TV printing. You can talk to me later. I'm a cosplay guest here, so I have a table over in the cosplay guest area. If you have more questions about specific things, please don't hesitate to come talk to me. I like to talk about this stuff, and I talk about it entirely too much. But does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, you in the purple.
Is there any PLA or PETGs brands that you recommend not to use or to use?
Okay, so as far as not use, you can either have a positive or a negative experience with literally any filament, if only because of the build of your printer and the settings you use in your slicer. I personally use a lot of eSun. That's what I use to make the products for my day job. I also use eSun for their PETG when I do my cosplay props. I've had a lot of success with Prusa's PLA, but I also use Prusa printers, and so the PLA is formatted to work perfectly with our printers. Sunlu is a pretty solid company that I've worked with before. I like their filament a lot, as well as Urgoin. I can never pronounce it right. It's like EARYNE, but they have an outlet on Amazon, so there's a ton of them. Really just look at the reviews and see how many people have had success with it and decide whether you're willing to try it or not, because there's always an element. You will always fail with your prints. You just have to decide which filament is working more than failing for you. Does that make sense? Okay. Anyone else? Yes, you.
I'm having trouble putting my larger prints together. What's the best way to do that?
What kind of trouble are you having with that?
They don't stay together, they're all apart because of the weight of this.
Okay, so in that situation, you would want to run an armature up the center of it, like piano wire that you can get from Ace Hardware or Home Depot, or wood dowels of some kind. But additionally, what a lot of people do, I think his name is Frankly Built. He does a lot of Iron Man cosplays. I know I'm over time too, so if you guys want to book it, you're welcome to. My next panel is in this room, so if you want to hang out too, that's cool. But Frankly Built makes a lot of very large sword type props. Thank you guys for coming. I appreciate you. This was my first panel. I hope it wasn't awful. Anyway, Frankly Built uses a soldering iron to weld together the pieces. He'll like glue them together first, and then he uses a soldering iron to weld the seams. So it kind of turns into like a fused layer, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I tried the wood studs, but it's still like swabbles.
So are those wood studs, do they go the whole length of the prop? Thank you for coming.
That would be my, so you get like a long drill, drill.
No, so in that case, you need to modify the SDL file to be hollowed out for you to add that armature inside of it. Bye. Thank you guys for coming. I'll see you guys tomorrow.
Thank you.
Otherwise, because if you were to use a drill bit of some kind, you would punch through your outer walls and then into your infill, and infill doesn't have a structural rigidity to hang on to whatever trace up inside it.
So, but it would be hollow, so it wouldn't have stuff in anything.
I think we need to sit down and talk and have specific examples so I know better how to advise you. Oh, okay. So you're having trouble with that staying firm there?
Yeah. Right now.
We're just having fun.
It's fun.
Yeah, it starts at 5. We've got 10 minutes.
So I have 2 problems.